Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 46, and today I'm here with Claire Bidwell Smith talking about grief. Claire is a mom and therapist specializing in grief and the author of 3 books about grief and loss: The Rules of Inheritance, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. If you are enjoying the Sage Family Podcast, then please take a minute to leave a review in iTunes. EOB14 writes, "Every episode by Rachel is an elixir for the soul. Her voice is poetry, and her support through the audible airways is tangible. She is hope embodied and beauty shared. Every episode needs to be listened to more than once because her wisdom runs deep. If you have time to listen to one podcast, this is the one to prioritize. Thank you, Rachel, for inspiring and lifting, for helping all who listen, imagine, and dream. Thank you sincerely for such beautiful and kind feedback, EOB14. Truly, I am honored. And if you want to directly support the show, then please join the Sage Family Patreon community. We've had 46 episodes of this podcast and 0 ads or sponsors because of people like you voting with their money for the kind of voices they want to hear and the kind of world they want to live in. Plus, it's just a very cool club to join with live Q&A videos every month and loads of special freebies. Head on over to patreon.com/Sage Family and join the gentle parenting party. In today's Adventure of the Week turned Thriving in Quarantine segment, let's talk about working from home with kids. I have spent the last dozen or so years building and running a business, including writing 8 books, creating classes that have served thousands of families, and supporting hundreds of families through virtual coaching, all with my 3 homeschooling children. This has been an intentional lifestyle choice that I wholeheartedly believe benefits me, my children, and the world. I've always referred to it as living a family-integrated life, which is so much more aligned with how evolution designed us to thrive, as opposed to the current societal norm of ostracizing the young and the old. As a woman, I am able to be in close connection with my little ones while fulfilling myself as a whole person. My children are included in the wide array of tasks that are a part of daily working, learning, and living in the real world, and society benefits from all the meaningful work that has sprung from this well. But I do recognize how profoundly different this way of working is from the pre-pandemic mainstream. So I'm going to share some shifts that I've witnessed as significantly helpful in making this transition successful. First, focus with children present has to be more permeable. I like to visualize it like holding a thought in my open palm as opposed to my clenched fist. Yes, this way of working takes longer, but it also allows my thoughts more opportunity to air out and dance around me. It feels less forceful and it produces better work for me. That said, there are times when we are deep in the creative flow, and to honor those times, set up small chunks. Studies actually show that's better for focused work anyway. No one is in that deep creative flow for 8 hours. When you know you have 1 hour to work on something deep, you go deep for that 1 hour, working harder and faster. So while I can easily flit through emails or accounting or even outline style writing in the midst of some chaos, I would reserve writing a piece about the evolution of my grief, for example, for one of those focused chunks. During those chunks, it's helpful to set up an invitation for your children. Bring a set of materials out of rotation and just put them together in an interesting way in a featured space. And set the expectations with your children for how they will navigate their needs during that chunk of time. It's essential to base your own expectations here on what is developmentally appropriate given your child's age and their unique way of being. Role play potential needs that could come up and how you will respond to inevitable interruptions. So we've set expectations for our children and for ourselves. The next step is to set them for your coworkers, company, or clients. Don't apologize for the existence of your children. Instead, confidently lay out what can be expected. I recently called into our bank Ally, and their pre-recorded message handled this perfectly, stating, quote, "Many of our customer care associates are working remotely at this time to care for themselves and their families, and we ask for your understanding should you hear a child or a pet in the background. Rest assured, we are prepared and ready to support you." Well done, Ally. I have to state emphatically that the problem is never the children. It is always your reaction to the children. If a child wanders into a video call and you calmly and confidently turn to your child and say, "I'm almost done with my video call. It ends at 2:00, remember? I'll be out to help you as soon as it's done," there really isn't a problem. If you jump up in a panic and start yelling and threatening, that is what makes you look bad. Interestingly, classes I've taught with a crying nursing baby or a chatty child have always garnered the best reviews. Witnessing you navigate a challenging situation with calm confidence doesn't diminish the respect others have for you. It increases it. If you want to see photos and videos of how I work from home, then head on over to sage.family on Instagram and follow along. I read Claire's book After This while searching for new inspiration around ways to feel connected with my mom after her death. Then I read her book Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief, and I just found both books to be so helpful that I had to invite her here to share a conversation with me about grief. So will you share your story with us, Claire? Who are you and how are you connected to grief?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to broaden the conversation about grief. It's something I've been experiencing personally and then professionally for over 2 decades now. I am a almost 42-year-old mom. I'm living in Charleston, South Carolina right now, and both of my parents got cancer at the same time when I was 14 years old. I was an only child, and they were a little bit older. They'd had me a little bit later in life, but my mom died when I was 18, and then my father died when I was 25. And as you can imagine, it was incredibly difficult to go through. It was the loss of my whole little family. And so it was just, massive grief that I had no context for, no guidelines for, nowhere to turn really. And this was over 20 years ago when my mother died. And there was not as much as there is now in terms of grief support, either in books or online. I really felt very alone in my peer group. All my friends were in college. They were graduating. They were going off to their first post-college jobs. They were getting into relationships, and I was just trying to figure out how to stay afloat emotionally. I had a lot of ups and downs. I struggled with anxiety and depression and alcohol abuse here and there. I got into some troubled relationships. I eventually kind of started to come through it in my late 20s. I found work that was really meaningful to me. I started working for nonprofits and helping with homeless people, underserved kids. I decided to go back and get my master's in clinical psychology. And when I graduated in my late 20s, I started working as a grief counselor for hospice. My father had died in hospice, and it had been a really healing experience. My mother had had a really different death. She was kind of in denial about facing the fact that she might die or that she would die. And we really never said goodbye. We didn't come to terms with it. She did not have a peaceful death. She just kept trying medical intervention after intervention. And so she died in a hospital. I wasn't there when she died. And that death really haunted me. My father, on the other hand, he was older and he'd lived through a lot in his life, and he just had a much more intentional approach to the end of his life. And he asked me to go along with him in that approach. So he wanted to be at home. He wanted hospice. He wanted me to be there and care for him. And I fought some of that along the way because it was so scary and so hard. Again, I was 25 years old and no one I knew had gone through anything like this, or knew how to support me. My peer group didn't, and I didn't really have any family around. But my father was so thoughtful about it and so brave, and he really asked me to hold his hand up through his death, and it ended up being a very peaceful, healing, and beautiful experience. And it taught me a lot about what the end of life can be, what death can be. And having that contrasted experience with my mother's death, I really saw the spectrum. So when I finished my graduate work, I just naturally gravitated toward hospice. And then I really saw the full spectrum because I saw people of all ages going through all kinds of losses and experiencing all different kinds of paths throughout their grief process. And I was a young mother at the time. I was in my early 30s when I was doing that work. And that was also an interesting contrast, as bringing my first daughter into the world while I was helping people exit the world. And I don't know, I've constantly seen a lot of polarities in life, a lot of the spectrum of it, and it's made me very appreciative and grateful and searched for a lot of meaning in my days and in my moments and my relationships. I've now written 3 books about grief and loss. The first one is a memoir that covers my ups and downs moving through my parents' deaths. And then the second one is a book about how looking into the afterlife and trying to forge connections with the people that we lost, either spiritually, religiously, all different ways, is helpful to the grief process. And then my most recent book, Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief, is really based on all my years working in private practice as a therapist, which I did in Los Angeles for a long time after the hospice work. And what I saw was that so many people were coming out of a big loss and experiencing huge amounts of anxiety, sometimes for the first time in their lives. And so I really wanted to make that connection between grief and anxiety, which had not really been talked about before.
I mean, your personal story and then your professional experience come together to provide the rest of us such a wealth of inspiration and information in what's happening within us as we're walking through grief. So just to take a minute to acknowledge that, some gratitude around everything that you've been through so that we all can learn from it. So
thank you.
I am grateful for your story. And I was hoping that we could start with the cultural piece. And I wanted to ask you how our culture does a disservice to the transition of death. When most of my work was in the, like you talked about, on the other end of the spectrum of life with having babies and little ones. And there were so many taboos and unsupportive parts of our culture around that part of life that I pushed back against a lot in my work. And then when I had a miscarriage, I was blown away by the void of ritual or the whole grief. The whole end of life piece was just seemed to be missing. There was a void where something should be. And then, of course, when I lost my mother, I mean, that was 100-fold more profound and prevalent. So talk to us about how our culture does a disservice to the transition of death.
Yeah, it definitely does. There are other cultures in the world that do a better job of embracing death, of kind of honoring our ancestors on a regular basis. In our Western culture, we largely shy away from death and end of life. And we don't have a lot of rituals around it. We have the basic, funeral, memorial, Shiva kind of things. But then from there on, people really tend to move on quickly, or emotionally, psychologically. Even when you're grieving, people around you will want you to move on quickly, and they will encourage you to, rather than being able to sit with you in it more often. So I think that sends a message to people when they're grieving and when they've gone through loss, that there's something wrong with them if they're still experiencing a lot of the emotions around it. And that's what I'm always striving to demystify and change. I really thought for years that there was something wrong with me because I still missed my mom. I had such huge feelings around my mother's death. They were bigger than my father's for different reasons. I had a deeper relationship with her. Her death was so much more fraught for me. Being a young woman, just missing a mom was a big thing. And then becoming a mother without one was also very difficult. But I really, for a long time, thought that was singular unto me, and that there was just something wrong with me. And the more that I began to understand the grief world and see other people grieving and read more about it, research, education, I realized that there was nothing wrong with me. We just don't talk about it in this culture. We don't know how to hold space for those feelings. And a lot of it's because it's uncomfortable, it's painful, it's sad. We hate seeing people in distress, emotional distress, psychological distress. It's really hard for us to do that. We want to tidy it up. We want to fix it. We want to make them feel better. So that's often how this kind of plays out,
Yeah. When I was in the hospital with my mom, her whole end of life transition happened what felt like very quickly. She had a pain in her leg, and then she was in the hospital, and 60 days later she was gone. And for those last couple of months, I flew down and was living in the hospital with her and taking care of her. And there was this moment towards the end where she was expressing how concerned she was that she wouldn't be able to help the people that she loves through this transition. And I told her, like, you don't have to worry about me. Like, I will be okay. And I totally meant it when I said it. I said it with such conviction and confidence, and I totally believed it. And then she died, and I realized, oh my God, like, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
I'm not okay. I had no idea what it would be like or feel like on the other side of that loss. I had no path for it. I've never really seen anybody navigate it, and culturally, I just had no impression of what it would even be like. I mean, when someone dies in the movies, it's like they're sad for a day and then they get up and go take on the world again.
I think that's part of it. I think that grief and loss, I think it's an unknowable thing until you've been through it, right? Like your miscarriage, the loss of your mom, there's no way to prepare for it. There's no way to know the depths of that, to understand it until it happens to you. So I think even when people are looking in from the outside and they're trying to be supportive, they just cannot fully understand how deep it is, how huge it is, what it feels like to go through that kind of loss.
Yeah, and I think in all of, your writing and other things I've read have been helpful in accepting too that there's some special, I don't want to say layer of grief, but there's some special element to the loss if it's like a daughter losing their mother. And that surprised me too, even though so much of my work is based on like the connection between a mother and her children. And yet I did not anticipate the way that, like, when I gave birth, I experienced a rebirth. Like, all of the pieces of my identity were sort of on the floor. And I really have gone through the same thing with the loss of my mother. It's that, yes, I miss her, and there's the grief around that, but then also somehow there's this additional layer of losing who I am and how I fit into the world without this core person existing in the world with me.
Yeah, you can never go back to who you were before that loss. There is a rebirth. You do become a completely different person. You're forced to rebuild and just kind of rebirth yourself. And I think it's I keep talking about this on a large scale right now since this COVID-19 crisis has happened, that as a world, we're going to go through that kind of rebirth, which is just fascinating and humbling and also kind of beautiful.
Yes, yes. My friend Cassidy, who I think you know too, Dr. Cassidy Freitas,
Hmm.
she likes to say brutiful. It's like brutal
Yeah.
and beautiful, and I'm definitely feeling that with being in this pandemic and being in touch with the sense that so many people are going to be grieving, and hoping that people will be very intentional with that rebirth process and choosing how they want to put themselves and their lives back together moving forward. Okay, I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I've been completely ignoring all of like the outline that
That's
of
okay.
things that I wanted to
I
talk
like to
about.
go off script anyway.
I'm completely off script. Like I left script like 30 seconds into this conversation. Okay, let's talk about anxiety. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief were actually for the dying, though our culture has applied them liberally to anyone experiencing grief. You propose that for those of us grieving loved ones, anxiety is the missing stage of grief. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think it's really gone unacknowledged for a long time that anxiety is a natural component of grief. I love Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I revere her work, and she, always talked about how the five stages, there's so much more to them. People love this idea of there being five stages, so they cling to them. And I went ahead and used that title because I knew that nobody was going to let go of this idea of the five stages anytime soon. And the reason people like it is because wouldn't it be great if there was a simple formula when you're going through such enormous pain and rebirth? Wouldn't it be great if there was just this 5-step process and you would be
Yeah.
like, okay, I do this and then I go through this feeling and then that one and great, I'm done now. I'm going to be all
Yes.
better. And so
Complete.
they're very appealing, right? So that's why I think we've clung to them for so many years, about 50 years now. She came out with the stages of dying in the 60s. And so, but the one that I always really felt was missing was anxiety. It was something I experienced myself after my mom died and then my father. I had a lot of panic attacks and a lot of anxiety. And then it was something I started to write about. I wrote a couple articles online and I suddenly just got flooded with people writing to me, coming to my office saying, is this a thing? Is anxiety really a part of grief? Because no one was talking about it. And so then I just had an entire clientele full of anxious, grieving clients, which was great because I was able to really study it, not just study it for myself, but really see how it was manifesting, how it was playing out, how it was coming on with so many people. And I felt like I really needed to put this book out there and this work out there. It's totally normal that we experience anxiety after a loss. I mean, as you know, it just completely changes the way that you see the world, right?
Yeah.
You suddenly know that you can lose one of the most important people to you. Before that happens, you don't really understand that, you don't really feel it or know it on a soul level. And once you've gone through that, it makes all of life seem a little bit more precarious. I think that we operate under an illusion of safety most of the time. We think that we can plan ahead. We think we can, take care of things and make sure that nothing bad is going to happen. And then things happen beyond our control all the time. And it's never proven more often than when we lose somebody we love. And so that can be very overwhelming. And then also on top of that, just the sheer level of emotions we experience when we're grieving can be so overwhelming that itself can cause anxiety. I will ask you, have you ever felt more vulnerable than you did in those times when you were grieving?
No.
Right.
And I had never really experienced anxiety until I was in grief. And in
Mhm.
addition to all of those things that you talked about, I think the actual death itself for so many people can bring on a whole extra dose of anxiety, whether it's like a sudden loss, like you're just sitting at the dinner table and you get a phone call that someone you love died in a car accident, like that
It's
moment.
traumatizing. All the
Yes.
ways, though. Your mom having a pain in her leg and then being gone 2 months later. I mean, that's traumatizing that something like that can happen.
Yes.
And miscarriages as well, especially when that's in your own body and like you think you have some semblance of control over something like that. And then all that feeling of safety and control is taken away. And it's that same idea of what we're experiencing right now in the world. How do you sit with so much uncertainty? How do you wake up every day and know that you have no control over what's going to happen? How do you stay sane through that, right?
Yes.
And in the initial awareness that you're going through when you're grieving, it's really hard to not have anxiety.
Yeah, and I mean, really, at its core, like anxiety is our body and our brain's way of protecting our survival. And so when you've lived through an experience of somebody you love not surviving, so like that autonomic response kicking in and then not being able to save somebody that you love, that wreaks havoc on on that, that trauma really wreaks havoc on that system.
Absolutely. There's good news and bad news about anxiety. The bad news is that it can be insidious. So once it comes on, it can get really cyclical and you can get a little bit stuck in it sometimes. The good news is that anxiety is really treatable. You can really work with it. There's a lot of great things you can do to get control over it and to diminish the anxiety. And one of the first things to remember about it is, like you said, it's actually a useful thing. We have anxiety for a reason. When I was researching for my book, I was talking to an anxiety specialist and I asked him if it was possible to completely get rid of it. And he laughed at me. And he was like, no, why would we want to? We need anxiety. It serves a purpose most of the time. It helps us prepare for things. It helps us remember what we have to do tomorrow. It helps us get ready to give a big talk or to go on a trip or, take care of a child. That low level of anxiety kind of keeps us in that space of preparedness. When anxiety gets away from us and it's debilitating and it's affecting, how we function throughout the day or our emotional state or our relationships, that's when we have to take action.
Yes, and I have a whole episode that I'll link to in the show notes focused on anxiety. And in it, I talk a lot about how when helping kids with anxiety, I like to kind of externalize and personify it as like your warrior, and really help people to change their relationship with anxiety as opposed to trying to kill it or evict it. Like, how can you be grateful for it? How does that help you? How does it serve you? So what other advice do you have for self-care and grief or for helping us through that anxiety?
I think that is a great tool. It's always really helpful to externalize it. What happens is we end up giving it so much control. We think we think we have no control over it and it's just coming on and we are a victim of it. But really there's a lot of action we can take to separate ourselves from the anxiety. But first and foremost is just recognizing it. It's one of those, really hidden afflictions. Someone can have anxiety and you don't even know. People can be very good at hiding it and presenting like everything is fine, but really inside they can be an anxious mess, or they can be, having behaviors that are spilling out in places that you don't see that are caused by anxiety.
Especially in grief, because you're all also feeling all of these other really strong emotions.
Absolutely. I think there's so much shame in our culture around these big vulnerable experiences and emotions, which is really a shame. I'm so glad there's people like Brene Brown who are constantly working to break down the shame around vulnerability, because that's what's at the same root of this. We have to first recognize that we are in a vulnerable state, that we are grieving, that we are anxious. We have to have some kind of self-acceptance around that, some compassion for ourselves and other people who are going through it. Once we can do that and own it and hold it, then we can really start to work with it. And then I start to bring in tools, like cognitive behavioral tools, meditation, just really starting to become aware of our thoughts, how they're affecting us, the choices we're making about certain thoughts. Even like as a small example of today, in today's environment, really choosing not to spend your whole day watching the news. It's not going to end well for you if you do that. It's going to keep you in a very anxious state.
But so Trump inspires so much calm and confidence in me.
Oh, he does. At least put on some Cuomo. So yeah, like I think that really being conscious about how we're choosing to, where we're choosing to focus our thoughts is really important. And just starting to become aware. I think in my 20s, I remember it was really like an aha moment for me when I started to meditate. I had really hit rock bottom when I finally found meditation and yoga. I mean, I was just in a place where I kept getting into terrible relationships. I kept struggling with alcohol. I was just miserable a lot of the time. And the last things I wanted to try were yoga and meditation because I was just like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. I don't want to do it. It just sounded annoying and hard and trendy or something,
Yeah.
something I just didn't want anything to do with. And I finally ended up in those spaces, and they were the things that saved me. And it was because I had not been aware of how I was behaving. I wasn't being aware of my thoughts. In the morning, I would wake up and just follow a thought pattern into negative places or anxious places. I wasn't having compassion for myself. And those practices really taught me those things, which were the things that steered me away from the anxiety finally.
Yeah, they bring in an element of consciousness, like to your movement and your thoughts and what you're feeling in your body. I have a post I'll link to called When Self-Care is Survival, in which I share 12 acts of self-care that were oxygen to me in the deep end
I
of
love that.
complicated grief, including a lot of the things that you talk about in your book, like meditation and writing. People have heard me talk about yoga a lot on this podcast. It was never that like sort of essential for me. It was like one of the things that I would do from time to time as a physical movement practice. But when in grief, like it became absolutely essential, like for me to show up on the mat and move my body and
Yeah.
feel strong and get in touch with my breath and to
It's
feel the
it's
oxygen.
vital.
Yeah, yeah.
And what it is that yoga in particular and meditation, they bring us into the present moment. And when we're grieving, that's not where we are. When we're grieving, we are in the past reviewing things and thinking about what we had, what we could have done differently, blah, blah, blah. And then we're also spinning out into the future, thinking about what our life is going to be like now without that person, or, what is next Christmas going to be like, or, different things. We're constantly living in these two places of past and future. And when we cultivate practices like yoga and meditation and mindfulness, they bring us back into the present moment, into our bodies, into the only thing that actually exists, which is right now.
So much, yes. And we talk about that a lot on this podcast in terms of mindfulness and parenting. Like a lot of parenting struggles can be remedied with that mindfulness piece. Like a thought, floats through your mind and it triggers an emotional cascade and you're yelling at, whereas to just be in the present moment and observe the thought and let it float on by, like let the wave of emotion roll through you and trust that it will move through you. And so to be able to extend a lot of those things that especially the listeners on this podcast are really well versed and well practiced in the parenting sphere, I just want to invite them to extend that into the grief sphere, because I found a lot of those skills to be helpful in this context. And then letter writing. I was hoping you could touch on that a little bit too.
Yeah, writing has always been a huge part of my life. I was a writer before I was a therapist, or before my parents even got sick, I was writing. And so it was something I naturally turned to as I was struggling to cope. I would pour out a lot of my big feelings into writing. Later, I began writing letters to my parents. Around the time my mother died, 20, 30 years ago, the emphasis in the grief world was to help people learn how to let go of the people they lost. And what we've found, and the shift we've had and the way we're pivoting now, is that rather than helping people let go, we need to help people learn how to hold on and how to stay connected and how to take their lost loved ones with them into the rest of their lives.
Yes.
And letter writing has been the way for me to do that. I write to both of my parents, not all the time, sometimes months will go by, but definitely at least once a year, if not more often. I will sit down and I will write them letters individually. I'll type them on my computer, I'll write them by hand, and it feels so good. It's so different than talking to them out loud or talking to them in your head or talking about them.
It's so
Something
much
about
more tangible.
how it is. The act of sitting down and writing, like, Dear Mom, this year I had another baby, or I'll just start weeping,
Yes.
but in a good way, in this really cathartic way that makes me feel connected to her again.
Yes, it's so nice to have like that practice is waiting there for you whenever you need it. I had like all these big plans for what I was going to do for my mom's death anniversary, like the first anniversary of her death, whatever the lingo is for that. And then because of the stay-at-home orders and all that, like all of my intention, all the thought that I poured into it, like I couldn't do any of it. And so I was one of the things I was going to do was to see a medium when I was on this little road trip that I was going to take. And so I had this like epiphany of, well, what would I hope that the medium would say to me? Like, what message would I hope that my mom would have for me? And so I wrote that. Like that was the letter that I wrote, like a letter to myself from my mom, basically on the other
That's so
side.
good.
And
That's like one of the harder ones that I'll try to get clients to do, and they're somewhat resistant. But that's such a great one. My dad did that one year after my mom died. He sat down and he wrote me a letter from my mom. And it is one of my favorite things ever. He like really channeled her. He had her voice. And he started out writing a letter just to me. And then he was like, I think your mom's going to take over now. And he just wrote this amazing letter that really could have been written by her. And it's just one of my favorite possessions.
that is amazing. And I have to say, like, the thing that sort of opened me up to that, and I'm sure I have this later in the outline, but was where you were asking in one of your books about the afterlife. What do you most want to happen when we die? And so I was thinking on that question, and it helped me to get more in touch with there's this element of freedom that comes when somebody you love dies. Like when they're alive, you're sort of bound by the limits of what they're able to offer you in life. And when someone passes away, there is an element of freedom in that now you get a little bit more of an active role in not like designing the relationship you have with that person, but you get to bring a little more, you get to take up a little bit more space in that connection, in that relationship. And so like I could write a letter from her to me, giving her perhaps like a greater perspective than she was able to have in this life. I find that element of freedom helpful.
Definitely. It's so healing to do that kind of stuff. It's just, I think that once people start to try it, they do realize how healing it is, how good it feels. It doesn't feel congruent to ourselves to not speak to somebody we had in our lives, our whole, existence, to just stop speaking to them. That impetus that's still there to like call your person or speak to them. We have to honor it.
Yes. And for a while after she died, I found that I couldn't write. Like I'm a writer, writing is what I do, and I just couldn't do it. And I know that the research is so supportive of journaling. It's like if you show up for your journal and just write what comes to mind, like the outcomes for that are really, really good, even in really severe cases of PTSD and things like that. So I would show up and just write like one word. So just for people out there listening who are thinking, I'm talking about like writing a letter to myself from my mother, like that wasn't like day 2 after she died. Like it started with me like journaling. It was literally single words. Like I would show up and I would write one word.
Oh yeah, it's messy sometimes, whatever you can get on the page. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the story piece. I mentioned how like giving birth was a rebirth for me. It really dismantled my entire narrative or the story I had of who I was and how I fit into the world. And I experienced that same rebirth with the death of my mother. completely dismantling my understanding of myself and the universe. And I've had to work very intentionally and often painfully to write a whole new edition of my story. And you find this work of unpacking your baggage invaluable in grief. And by the way, I have used that metaphor in all of my books, and I talk about it here on the podcast. So I was excited to see it in your book. And all the sage families out there are very familiar with it. But why does loss have that effect?
I've always found the correlation between the work I do as a therapist and a writer really interesting because it's all about the story that we carry. Writing is obviously about telling stories and crafting narratives and editing things and changing things around. And therapy is the same way. People come into my office and they have a story. They have a story of loss. They have a story about themselves. They have a story about their life. And sometimes the story doesn't work. It doesn't serve them. And sometimes it's hurting them. And
It no
the
longer
work that
fits.
the work we do together is to kind of pick that story apart and pick the narrative apart and maybe start to look at it in a different way, or even just to do research sometimes. One of the things I wrote about in my book was sometimes we carry around a story that is serving us because we're still angry or because we're feeling guilty, and we're holding on to pieces that might not even be that truthful. So going back and doing some research, and again, this is the kind of work you do 5-10 years out from a loss. It's not right away, but sometimes we have to go back and look at, could I really have changed things if I had showed up here, or if I had done something differently there? Sometimes we're holding on to these pieces that are not true. Like, I'm a bad person because I did A, B, or C. And when we pick those things apart, sometimes we get to change that narrative, and that changes how we feel about ourselves. That's what adds and lends to this sense of rebirth. We rediscover a new narrative that we get to carry.
Yes, I completely agree with all of that. And I think, one of the things that we didn't talk about in like helping people through with the self-care and with the anxiety and all that, it's sort of implied, but is that like a therapist can help you.
Right.
in all of this.
Great for this. It's hard to do this work on your own. I couldn't do my own work. I was in therapy for years, and it was what made me want to do the work. It's so hard to do this work for ourselves. Even now, when I go through something big, I will definitely turn to a therapist because it's just it's hard to see our own stuff in that way. When you can sit across from someone who has compassion for you and who you trust and who you feel safe with, and then they can gently help you be like, well, Claire, what if you looked at it this way? Or what if that's not true? You can suddenly have these amazing aha moments that you can't quite achieve on your own.
Yes, I completely agree. When in the aftermath of my mother's death, like as the months started to tick by, it sort of felt like I had been injured with this like gaping wound, and it was scabbing over, and this is sort of a gross analogy, but it really feels like it fits. Like it was scabbing over, but there was still like bacteria and bits of gravel in it. And what therapy was for me was like ripping open the scab, but like flushing out and cleaning out the wound so that it could heal like I wanted to heal intentionally. I wanted to be conscious about the scar that's there, because it did feel like some things were like becoming permanent, some like beliefs and some
I think
some
that's
truths.
a great analogy. It's similar to the suitcase one that you referenced earlier. I've always said that when somebody comes in to see me in my office, it's like they're dragging this big heavy suitcase, and they bring it into the room, and it's like duct taped together and like chained up, and then we have to like unlock the thing, and then it just kind of explodes open with all this stuff they didn't even know was in there, And we spend this period of time together, weeks or months or years, really taking each thing out, looking at it. Sometimes it's a really painful process along the way, because you're like, oh, I don't want to see that. I don't want to show that to anybody. I don't want you to see that. But then along the way, we start to get rid of some of it, or we start to repack it differently. And eventually the work that we do together, we repack that suitcase, we put in some new useful things, we take out some stuff that doesn't need to be there anymore, we move some other things around, and we close it up nicely. Send them back out with a nice suitcase.
So we're going to Cone Marie your inner world.
Exactly.
Great. So let's talk about the afterlife. Now, you encourage people to explore their views on the afterlife. And one of my favorite questions that I read in your book was that question I mentioned earlier about what do you most want to happen when we die? And you go on to encourage people to explore belief systems around their answer to that question. And I also read your book after this, which I very much enjoyed. And it basically explores this question in depth. What did you learn through your journey of seeking connection with your parents and friends after their deaths?
I just found so much healing. That was a big turning point for me. I was really raised in a non-religious background, upbringing, nothing really. Like we went to some churches here and there, just like random Christian affiliated churches, but nothing ever serious. Like I did a little random Sunday school here and there, but I just came out into adulthood with no firm beliefs about anything. And when I was trying to reconcile all of this loss and then further trying to reconcile all these other people I was working with and their losses, I had no framework for it. I had no context with which to understand it or to process it. And I started to really wonder, what does happen when we die? For a long time, for me, it had just been easier to believe that nothing happened. This was it. It was over. But as I got older and as I experienced more of the world, I just really started to wonder more about it. So I went on this kind of 5-year journey of dipping in and out of all kinds of modalities of spirituality and religion and new age stuff and psychic mediums, just trying to come up with different things for myself that were useful, that felt good to me, and then also for my clients who were going through their own quests. I think it's really natural when we lose somebody that we start to question it. Even if we've come through that with a really strong framework, we even sometimes question that. I've had so many clients who are angry with their God, are angry with their religion, and they're questioning that process. And so I found that it's really helpful to find your own belief system around it, your own ways to connect. For 5 years, I asked people, what do you think happens when we die? And it was really fun. Like the answers were amazing and so different. And everybody was excited to talk about it because there's no place where we're ever invited to talk about that.
Yeah.
Like there's no context in which that happens. And I was doing it at dinner parties and, at the park with moms and just like, what do you think happens? And people would be like, whoa, no one's ever asked me that. And then they would start to have questions as they talked about it too. And, but I, towards the end of my book, I ask this kind of, this like sardonic writer friend of mine in LA. I was like, what do you think happens when we die, Rob? And he was like, Claire. And he like exhaled his cigarette and he was like, what do you want to happen when we die? And I was like, whoa, no one's asked me that. And it was very freeing and interesting. And I was like, I need to answer this question. And that took me like another year to kind of answer that question for myself. What do I want to happen when we die? But I think once you start to play around the edges of those things is where you can begin to seek out and find spiritual and religious frameworks that work with them. I think people are afraid to play around with it and explore it. I think either you have something that you were raised with that you feel like you shouldn't stray from, or you haven't ever delved into any of it. And so there's some stigma and taboo around some of the things, especially when I was seeing psychic mediums and things like that. But I finally just relaxed into it all. And I was like, let's be curious. Let's be our own anthropologists, of ourselves and our own belief systems. And it was really healing for me.
Yeah, to be curious and playful. It's funny because a lot of this podcast too talks about homeschooling, and we talk about how like homeschooling is not something you do to a child. It's like a lifestyle that you live with your child that brings like this everyday state of wonder where you just walk through life with a playful curiosity. And so to be able to extend that in a conversation about grief, to be able to extend that into areas that are often so shielded by like authority or shame. I hope people feel a little bit more empowered and to bring some lightness, like and extend all of those other ways that we explore all these other ideas into this arena of death and the afterlife.
I love that.
Okay, how can we help kids through the loss of a loved one?
I think we have to really not think about not think about the loss through our adult minds. Kids are so different. They're magical, first of all. They have like incredible, beautiful um, ways of thinking about the world and seeing the world. And so we have to embrace that. And we also have to remember not to put our own grief on them. So if we're looking at like an 8-year-old who's just gone through the loss of a parent, they're not looking at it the way we are. We look at that and we go, oh my gosh, they're not going to be here for their 16th birthday and their high school graduation and when they get married and have babies. The 8-year-old's not thinking about that, right? The 8-year-old's just in the moment. So really, kind of trying not to put all of that on them. Those things will come. It's not ever going to be easy, but I think that grief becomes this very extended process for children. It's something that they come back to time and time again in new understandings as they develop and mature. And so continuing to kind of meet them, being really open with them, I think is important. Even if you don't know the answers, it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to ask them, what do they think? I've had some really interesting conversations about the afterlife with my kids, and they're like, what happens when we die? And I'm like, I don't know, and letting that be okay, or asking them what they think and letting their creativity come into it, their hearts and their love, and letting them develop their own belief systems early on, I think and play around with them is really important. But I think just being really open and holding space for it is really important. I think we get scared to talk to them about it. So we try to shut it down kind of quickly. Like, well, that's what happens. And like, okay, let's go outside and play,
Yeah.
And more than anything, and this is how our culture ends up shying away from death, because we're taught that so early on. So if we can stop that method, I think if we can just continue to teach our kids to hold more space for grief and loss and death, and to teach them customs and rituals and honoring our loved ones. My mom's birthday was last week, and my daughters and I made a cake for her, and sang to her. And that's totally normal for them. We do that every year. And,
That's beautiful.
yeah. And I know when I die that they will like very easily and quickly start to do that. It will not even be a question for them what to do when my birthday rolls around after I'm gone. They'll be like, oh, we'll make her a cake and we'll sing to her, and like, we'll have some sparklers in it. And like, of course, obviously. And I think that's the way that we will work with our kids and heal our culture around death and dying.
So many beautiful gems in what you just said that I don't know, what do you think? Is those two questions together are a tremendous gift that you can give your children. And I think I literally have those words in the Sage Homeschooling book, because I encourage parents to use them in so many different arenas. And again, let's like extend all of that stuff into grief as well. The other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to just highlight was that avoidance of discomfort piece. The work of, let me look behind me here at the book title, because I forgot. Oh, Emotional Agility. I've talked about that book a bunch of times in this podcast. She talks about like leaning into discomfort, and I want to highlight that you brought that up, because I completely agree that oftentimes when we're trying to help our children through grief, when we feel uncomfortable, we just try to avoid it. We leap for the exit. And that holding space phrase that we're talking about, it means to just use that mindfulness and those meditation skills to just sit in it with your kids as much or as little as they need.
It's not easy. And I had to put my practice into real life with that recently. Like, I can talk about this all day, and then all of a sudden I have to actually do it, and it's a different thing. We moved across the country last fall, and both of my daughters really grieved. They really grieved their friends. They're with the only town that they'd ever known, and I was shocked by how deep it was and how frequent their grief like attacks and outbursts were, just the real heavy crying, like really missing things. And my immediate thing was like, oh my God, I have to make this stop. I have to make this stop for them. I can't bear to watch them in this kind of pain. And then I knew I just had to sit there. And I think part of it was that it was so painful for me to watch them in pain. But it really was, it helped to just have me sit there and hold space for them and let them cry, let them talk through all their feelings, let them say all the things that even hurt me. And that was what, started to help them move through it.
Yes. And again, this is what we talk about like in the parenting sphere is to, when your children are upset, to not swoop in and be the problem solver, to let them feel their feelings. And your role as the parent is not to create a life in which they never feel pain or disappointment or upset, because that's not possible, A, and B, that's not the kind of life I would want my kids to live. Like I want them to live fully, and to live fully, you're going to feel a spectrum of emotions, and the job is to join with them in that space and just reflect it and validate it and hear it and listen to it and be supportive of whatever those feelings they're having are. I also want to add that I discovered a profound reflection between birth and death. And earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that too, which made me smile. My children were present and included in the births of their siblings. And it felt equally important for them to be a part of losing their grandmother, of her actual death too, in the same vein. So my children know what it is to show up fully for life, including both birth and death. And inclusion in both transitions looked like holding a space of love and respect, non-judgmental acceptance of feelings and what is beyond our control, and following their lead around what they need to move through it. So it really felt, as I was supporting my kids in that space, like in that hospital room, exactly the same as supporting them in the birthing room. And just the outcome, obviously the emotional outcome is so different, but the actual experience of it felt just as important and profound. And it felt like I was trying to bring those same elements into it.
I love that. Yeah, I've long talked about how similar birth and death are, and they require the same kind of energy and emotional space and reverence and work and practice.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yes. And children process in the landscape of the play world. So it would be normal for them to play out things of death, themes of death.
Definitely.
Yeah. Which we shouldn't be afraid of. Like it's normal for them to talk about it a lot, and it's normal for them to not talk about it at all. Like when my youngest, I think I mentioned it in an earlier episode of this podcast, we were out on a nature hike in the middle of nowhere on an island, and he stepped on a wasp's nest and was attacked by wasps. And there was like a solid 2 months maybe where he told the story to every single adult that we came into contact with.
I love that.
Like that storying was healing for him. Like every time he told it, like, he would tell it like a little bit differently, or he'd glean something different from the person's, response, or the telling of our stories and having them witnessed. Like there's a profound healing in that. So again, like you mentioned, like just sort of holding the space for them to work that out in what, like trust them, like trust whatever their process is. As long as you're holding space for whatever it is, you can trust that they're working on it, chewing on it in whatever way makes the most sense for them.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, though, I'll add that my experience was that it was my okayness or lack thereof that had the biggest impact on my children. And to be clear, like it's okay for your children to see you grieve, but what do you do in and with that grief? That felt really important for us. So like my children saw me taking lots of walks and going to therapy and doing yoga and writing and getting help from doctors for physical health issues that came up, because of course we metabolize trauma through our bodies too. So taking care of yourself while in connection with your children is a tremendous gift to them. And then just
that's how we'll continue to change this culture around it. When they do go through grief, inevitably, as they will in their lifetimes, they will have had a really beautiful model for that.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
You're welcome.
And then just weaving your lost loved one throughout your life moving forward through things like rituals and stories and inherited values, like you talked about with the cake, or like when we see people on the street corner, like with signs asking for food or money, it never fails. One of my kids always brings up that grandma always bought an extra meal when she went through a drive-through and like gave it to somebody. So
I love that.
yeah, like just those stories, like it's sort of feels like it keeps her alive.
Definitely.
Okay, now I want to switch gears a bit from the emotional to the more practical and talk about like some estate stuff. So, as the executrix of my mother's estate, I can tell you that what I had to go through in the wake of her death was just as hard as her actual passing. I felt panic at the reality that I had not prepared for the care of my children in a world without me in it. And now I feel such a deep sense of peace. It's a life raft of tangible evidence of your forethought for their well-being. And my legacy of love and care will live on for my children beyond my body. And that feels profound to me. And I'll link to a post I have with the 5 components of our legacy work, but I'd love for you to share how you have prepared for your death.
I couldn't love this more. This is what we need to be talking about all the time. We all need to be preparing for this. It's not morbid. It can be a little scary, but it's so important. As you know, as someone who's lost a mom, me going through the loss of my parents, there's so much left behind to sort through and to deal with, even just on really annoying legal perspectives and like all kinds of different levels of just stuff that there is to go through. The more that we can go through this and face it early on. And it's a way of taking care of our loved ones. It's a way of taking care of our spouses, our children, where they don't have to do that kind of work or have a lot of trouble doing that kind of work, and they can just be grieving. I have written lots of letters to my kids. I have written out all my wishes, a lot of like emotional stuff. Like I really want certain friends to check in on my kids here and there. If I were to go, tomorrow, I've appointed certain friends to check in on my kids and do things. I've asked one friend to like take one of my daughters to Paris at some point. I've, made very clear instructions about certain objects or jewelry or just different things I want them to have. I have a life insurance policy. I went through a divorce 6 years ago, and one of the first things I did was I went and I took out a really large life insurance policy on myself that would go to my kids if something happened to me, and that felt so good to do. I have a death doula friend, and she says, use the deathbed test. If you were on your deathbed and you had, 2 months to live, what is it that you need to take care of? Like, what is it you need to take care of practically, financially, emotionally? Are there people you need to make amends with? Are there things you need to write down? Does anybody know all your bank accounts and like what credit cards you have? Like, just
Yes.
basic stuff that you would have to do. I would say most people have not done this work. And I think it's really things we should be doing. It's such a gift to our kids. It is such a gift for them to, if something were to happen to you suddenly or down the road, that they have your wishes. They know where, if you would like to be cremated or buried, or if they receive like a brooch from your grandmother that you wanted them to have. It's a real treasure. So doing these things is very meaningful and helpful to your loved ones.
I could not agree more. Now, the show notes can be found at rachelrainbolt.com/podcast46, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. And as a part of this episode, I'm going to include in the show notes Claire's website and her Instagram and links to her books After This and Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. And your first one is called The Gifts of Inheritance, right?
The Rules of Inheritance.
Rules of Inheritance. So we will link to all that stuff. I also got some benefit from It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. I don't know if you've read that one, but I found
that book.
Yeah, good. Okay, I found it to be helpful too. So Claire, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me. I mean, professionally, I know that so many people are going to benefit this one was totally selfish though, and personally, I just wanted to share a conversation with you. So thank you so much for all that you do and for showing up here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rachel. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the conversations you're putting out in the world. It's such a gift to people.